Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is say thank you very much for the kind invitation to come to this meeting. It's been very enjoyable, and also for giving me this opportunity to share some of my research findings with you today. So my background is in vision science, and under that umbrella I'm interested in a number of things. I study normal vision, I study age-related visual decline, but one of the things that I'm interested in is how we see in a number of non-visual diseases, and often neurodegenerative diseases, we see that actually patients often manifest with visual symptoms. This is true of Alzheimer's disease, it's true of other types of dementia. Parkinson's disease is another example. And what I found just by chance when I was researching some other things on Web of Science, on the internet for a paper, is that actually patients often consistently will report that they experience visual symptoms associated with their ME/CFS. The key difference being that whilst there has been a reasonable attempt to map out visual deficits in things like Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, it seemed to me that no one had actually made any effort to try and quantify or even qualify these problems in ME/CFS. So that's what I've been trying to do. I would say that this research is in its infancy. I've been doing this just for the last 3 years, but I want to just share with you some of the findings so far. Okay, so as I've said, these visual symptoms are commonly reported by ME/CFS patients. And when I looked at the literature, actually there was virtually nothing there at all. On web forums, patients consistently reported them. They were discussed on these web forums, but when you went to the scientific or academic literature, there really was nothing there, with the exception of a few published studies from the very early 90s that had documented these problems. Often they had been documented by optometrists who had not only clinical interest but academic interest as well. But really there were only 3 of them. And what I found was actually there seemed to be these symptom clusters. So 3 kind of principal symptom clusters that came out of these self-reports was that patients often reported heightened visual awareness, so things like hypersensitivity to light, difficulty suppressing irrelevant or filtering out irrelevant background information, and difficulties in directing visual attention. Eye movement problems and problems tracking objects seem to be very, very common, and this included things like simply just moving the eyes to focus on an image. Patients report slow and sluggish eye movements, and also difficulty tracking object movement. And then last but not least, these visual difficulties of course seem to impact on everyday tasks. An example that seemed to consistently come out in these early self-report studies was actually patients had problems when they tried to read for, I guess, long periods of time. They reported being confused or distracted by irrelevant print either above or below the text they were trying to read, and also in actually tracking the words as they tried to read them along the page. Actually, in addition to this early study by Potasnik and Kozol actually reported that over 25% of the patients, I think it was around 80 to 100 patients they looked at, over 25% of them reported that they didn't drive anymore, because if they drove for even short periods, they would go home and suffer from really, really awful headaches, and they would often have to go to bed for a number of days. And they also reported that sometimes they didn't want to drive because they felt they weren't safe drivers, and they were worried about causing an accident. So that was the literature as it stood, and this led to some, I guess I then thought about what would be the objectives of this type of research programme. Of course, I'm sure I don't need to tell many of you here that when patients report vision-related symptoms to some of their healthcare professionals, like many symptoms, they're often disregarded. And so one of the principal things I think is really important is that you can actually take these self-reports and look and see whether you can actually provide objective experimental evidence to support these claims, particularly using tests that actually you can demonstrate that it's not really easy to cheat at these tests. You either show these visual problems because you have them. If you don't have these visual problems, it won't come up in the tests. So the objective, first of all, was actually to experimentally demonstrate that ME causes a range of these visual problems, and in doing so, to maybe look at whether we can identify some key visual symptoms that actually could be used and considered as clinical features. Because at the beginning, I mentioned that actually there are visual symptoms that are apparent in many non-visual illnesses, many neurodegenerative diseases, and indeed neuropsychiatric illnesses such as schizophrenia. One key illness with which patients are commonly misdiagnosed, where these types of visual problems are not apparent, is actually in depressive disorders. So this might also be an opportunity, if we can identify these, to actually provide evidence where you can differentiate things like ME/CFS from other conditions which often people are misdiagnosed with. Okay. So we started off with some self-reports ourselves. So we took, you can't really see this, I guess you don't really need to. The Potasnik and Kozol questionnaire was very, very short. So actually, it only has, I think, 3 questions and some subdivisions. So we gave this to 63 patients, but what we also included was a free response section where patients could write anything they wanted, any additional visual symptoms that they felt weren't covered in these initial questions, they could write them down. And what we did was we then quantified them. So we had our responses back from our patients, and we found a very high rate of visual symptom reporting. So, for example, things like blurred vision, trouble adjusting to depth, effectively all the things that had come up in these previous questionnaire studies. And we also had free responses here. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but what we found was that the most commonly reported symptoms included difficulties with focus, hypersensitivity to light. Patients often reported that they often had itchy or dry eyes, and also they reported vision-related headaches. The most frequent free responses were, again, pain in or around the eye, which is very likely to be directly related to itchy and dry eyes, and problems related to visual attention. So the next issue then was, okay, patients report these visual symptoms, but to make them worth studying, we would have to think about the actual impact they had in real terms on patients' everyday lives. So that was our second questionnaire study. So actually, some more recent measures, diagnostic criteria, actually have visual items in them already. So we started with this. So we used the DePaul symptom questionnaire, and it has 4 visual items. So one is sensitivity to bright lights, inability to focus vision and or attention, eye pain, and also a loss of depth perception. So there were 2 questions. We asked patients in the last 6 months, had they experienced any of the following, so each of these categories here, but we also asked them to rate the severity or bother associated with each of these symptoms. So we found a high frequency of responding in our 59 ME/CFS patients for all of these. So for eye pain, for inability to focus attention. So you can see here, this hasn't come out, sorry, this was on a Mac, the text hasn't come out quite well on this PC. So this is none of the above going all the way up, none of the time going all the way up to all of the time. So this was for the frequency of the symptoms, and for the severity and bother, we have symptom not present and very severe. So for each of them, we plotted both, and then we did some factor analysis. So the factor analysis showed that actually there was a very, very strong direct relationship between the frequency of the symptoms that our patients reported and also the impact on everyday life, or how severe or how bothersome they were to them on a regular basis. So in terms of each of these, we find that 92% of our participants or our patients did report experiencing sensitivity to bright light. 88% were unable to focus vision and or attention, 86% reported eye pain, and 61% reported loss of depth perception. So that led us to the next steps of the experimental work, and of course, these were the most common. So we started with sensitivity to bright light, or hypersensitivity. Photosensitivity is another way of describing this particular symptom, and then we also wanted to look at attention-based tasks so that we could see if we could find evidence, objective experimental evidence, to support these claims that patients find it very difficult to focus their vision and visual attention. Okay. So we started off, I thought to myself, won't that be easy? It's very easy to measure hypersensitivity. So we booked some patients in, and we tested our first 2. So we got them into a dark room. I thought, easy. The first thing we'll do is we will measure a brightness detection threshold. We'll keep going, and then we'll measure a discomfort threshold. I also thought a good thing to do would be to measure disability and discomfort glare, which again are very straightforward to measure and don't take very much time at all. By the second patient, it was very clear that that was not going to happen because patients find it really, really uncomfortable, and obviously we don't want to torture our patients for many reasons, so we abandoned that. But of course, I wanted to test this, so you then need to think, where you have a visual behaviour, in fact, when you have any human behaviour, you must have a physiological correlate. So if you find a behaviour, particularly if you find an anomalous behaviour, so something that's not manifested in a normal population, something must be going on in the brain. Of course, conversely, if you have abnormal brain activity, it must manifest in some kind of deficit or anomalous behaviour. So what does visual hypersensitivity represent? One of the things that it can represent a number of things, but one of the things that it can actually represent is hyperexcitability in primary visual cortex. And that is where the neurons in primary visual cortex love light. The more light there is, the more they will be responsive. But at some point, the visual system must turn down or modulate its own responses. So when things get too bright, the neurons that are responding to that light will saturate their responses, or they'll turn down their responses, kind of like turning down the volume in the brain. In cases of cortical hyperexcitability, the visual hyperexcitability, the visual cortex isn't able to do that. So you get this, I guess in crude terms, you get this overexcitation in primary visual cortex because it's not able to effectively modulate or turn down its responses. We find this in a number of conditions. So, for example, epilepsy is a good example, particularly photosensitive epilepsy. We find it in multiple sclerosis as well. It's also evident in quite a large number of patients who have suffered from a stroke. The next question is, if you have cortical hyperexcitability, how do you actually measure it? And actually, you can measure it very easily because the types of patient groups that I have mentioned suffer from a phenomenon that's known as visual stress or pattern glare. So we decided that we would measure that. We would try to measure that in our patients and in a control group as well. We panicked slightly because halfway through testing, a paper came out on visual stress and ME, but this is a questionnaire study. So actually, that works well for us because it provides further justification for this experiment. So we're almost finished this study. I think we should hopefully have it finished in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So presently, we have 20 patients and 17 age and gender matched controls. The pattern glare test is honestly could not be simpler. So actually, it potentially has really good clinical utility. So you have it's a flip book, and in it you have 3 patterns with horizontally oriented bars. So there's a pattern that has a low spatial frequency, a pattern with an intermediate spatial frequency, and a pattern with a very high spatial frequency. You won't see anything in these particular patterns because it's actually not the right spatial frequency for them to manifest on this screen. But what we do is we get patients to look at these 3 patterns. So we start with low, then we go intermediate, and then high, as per the instructions, and they have to report whether they experience any distortions. So the distortions they're asked whether they experience are colours, bending of lines, blurring of lines, shimmering or flickering, fading or shadowy shapes. No one will report many visual distortions on the low spatial frequency test, and that's important because actually that particular pattern acts as its own internal control. Because if people are saying they see things, then we know that they're not really, and they're actually probably just making it up. So, high spatial frequency patterns, most people will see some distortions. So actually, again, we don't really expect any differences between patients and controls. We expect that most people will actually report that they see them. The key is this intermediate pattern, because this intermediate spatial frequency, people will only report distortions if they actually have cortical hyperexcitability. And that's precisely what we find. So we have patients here in the blue bars and controls in the unfilled bars, and we find that for low spatial frequencies, as we would expect, some patients report and controls maybe report 1 or 2 distortions, but actually the scores are very low. We find that both patient and control groups for the high spatial frequency report quite a few distortions, but we find that at the intermediate spatial frequency, our controls report very few, but actually our patient group consistently report that they see some of these. And on the y-axis here, this is just the number of distortions we plot. So it's a very simple test, but very easy to administer, but already we're getting quite robust results. So the next thing we wanted to do was then look at this visual attention and the ability to ignore irrelevant background information. So we did this using a visual search task. This is data from 29 patients and 29 controls. So this is a conjunctive visual search task. It's actually very hard because the task is that you have to determine whether a predefined target is present or absent. It's called a conjunctive visual search task because the target, I have circled it in red here, obviously in the main experiment it wasn't circled. The target is a conjunction of the distractors. And by conjunction, I mean the distractors are either green squares or blue circles, but the target is a green circle, so it's actually quite difficult. So what we do is we vary the number of distractors. So in this case, the target is present, but the target doesn't necessarily have to be present. It can also be absent. So for example, in this, I've just replaced the green circle target with a distractor. What we find, so we measure reaction times here, and what we find is that patients are slower to find the target than controls. Of course, there is potentially a motor confound here, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the next data I present, because what you're asking people to do is make a motor response, and we know that ME/CFS has been linked with motor fatigue as well. So we're not actually, in this instance, necessarily interested in absolute reaction times. What we are interested in is the effect of increasing distractors. And what we find, if you look here, so when we plot a slope for these bars here, we find that this is what we would expect. So anyone, irrespective of whether they have ME/CFS or not, when you increase the number of distractors, the task gets harder, so it takes you longer to find the target, or to determine whether that the target actually isn't there. And obviously people are slower when the target is absent. They're slower to say that it's absent because they have to look through all the distractors to see if they can find it. So, but what we do find is that increasing the difficulty, so increasing the number of distractors, affects patient performance more rapidly and more deleteriously than it does controls. This is important because actually this shows that when patients report that they have difficulty suppressing or ignoring irrelevant background information, we show that in this task. This task also measures visual attention. So this is the first, or at least to my knowledge, experimental evidence that actually backs up these self-reports. What we also did is we wanted to look at this in more detail. So what's actually going on here? So again, in the same patient cohort, we looked at very basic measures of visual attention. So we have quite a simple task. So the first one, we measure visual processing speed. Our participants look at a screen. A target comes up in the center and their task. So the target comes up in the center, after which this response screen appears. And their task is to say whether the target that appeared is a car or a truck. We then use pretty much the same task, but make it a little bit more difficult. So this is just basic processing speed. We then have a second subtest, and it measures divided attention, so the ability for participants to actually divide their attention between the central target and the target that appears in the periphery. The task is effectively the same. The central target comes up, and something comes up in the periphery as well. On the response screen, they have to, again, just say whether it's a car or a truck by just clicking one of these, and then they have to say where in the surround, which one of these spokes did the second target appear. Okay, so we then have the third UFOV subtest, and we measured selective attention. This is just a further adaptation of this test, and we have exactly the same. You have a central target, a peripheral target, but the rest of the visual space is full of these triangular distractors. The task is the same: car or a truck, and then where did the second target appear? We find that patients and controls were patients were slightly impaired relative to controls, but actually this isn't real because there were no statistically significant differences at all. The key difference here is that we're not measuring reaction times, we're measuring display duration. So this is how long does this screen have to be up and visible to participants for them to reliably do the task. So everyone can do the task. Our patients can do the task. It's just that the information needs to be available to them for longer. So we find no difference in processing speed. We find a significant difference on divided attention, that patients are worse at dividing their attention between these between two simultaneously presented objects, but we find that they're really, really bad at actually selective attention tasks. This is different to what is actually in the literature. So I think it's also, this is an opportunity, I guess, to say about the positive things. What you don't want to do is find that everything is worse, because if everything is worse, it makes it extremely difficult to actually pinpoint what's going on. Visual processing speed didn't appear to be affected. As I said, in the literature, often you find actually that it is reported to be different, but when I looked at all the literature on this, so often people use neuropsychological test batteries and they find impaired visual processing speed, but you have to be very careful what you attribute to the visual system. In these tasks, reaction time measures are used. So when you look across the literature, the tasks that do demonstrate poor visual processing speed use reaction times. The ones that show no differences don't use reaction time measures. And what you're effectively doing if you use a reaction time is you're introducing a motor confound. So if the motor system's slow, that is a limiting factor. Okay, so very quickly then, I just want to then think about the last experiment we did. We did a quick experiment, just very quickly looking at eye movement control. And what we did is a very simple task. A central fixation appears. The participants are asked to fixate on the central fixation, after which a target will appear. So the target will appear to the right or to the left of fixation. On the saccadic task, so a basic saccadic eye movement, what they're required to do is move their eyes to the target. We then have an anti-saccade task. On an anti-saccade task, they're asked that when the target appears, they don't look at the target. They look on the other side of space, the other hemispace, at where they believe is equidistant from fixation. What we find when we plot the positional error, so how accurate they are at actually moving their eyes to the target or to the hemispace opposite the target, is that for basic saccadic eye movements, patients are slightly worse or slightly less accurate than controls, but this is not statistically significant. What is very statistically significant is actually when patients are asked to make anti-saccadic eye movements, they are much, much less accurate. So then, very quickly, just to summarise, so what we find actually is we've found experimental evidence of visual problems, and this experimental evidence supports patients' self-reports. We found poor performance on the pattern glare test, on a visual search task, on divided and selective attention, and also on eye movement tests. I think I've got about 40 seconds. So this has led us to a number of ongoing projects. What I first would say is that actually studying the visual system is not an easy task, because the visual system is not just the eye, it's not just the visual cortex, it's many areas of the brain. So we have the eye, primary and secondary visual cortices. We also have, these are bottom-up processes. We also have a lot of top-down processes as well. So more cognition also affects vision. And actually, when we're looking at these visual attention tests, we're looking at an interplay between vision and cognition. We're also, of course, having to factor in eye movements because we bring in to our field of attention things that we move our eyes towards and vice versa. So our ongoing projects in that, we've actually started to look at reading behaviour. We're also almost finished a study looking at vision-related quality of life in ME CFS patients, and we're just about to start a study looking at the ophthalmic correlates of ME. So is there anything going on in the eye? I'd just like then to, first of all, thank obviously the patients and the control participants that gave up their time to take part in this study. Also, I'd like to thank ME Research UK and the Irish ME Trust who gave us some money to begin this project that enabled me to employ Steve as a research assistant for 10 months. We've also got some follow-up funding to pay for Rachel's master's, and she's been looking at visual stress and reading and ME. We recently had some money from Fight for Sight, the eye disease charity, in collaboration with the Thomas Pocklington Trust, and that's enabled me to employ Nadia, who's an optometrist, for 2 days a week to look at the ophthalmic correlates. The work which is to come and is ongoing is in collaboration with Kevin and Doug in psychology at Leicester, because Kevin's an expert in eye movements and reading, and Doug is a cognitive psychologist with a background in neuroimaging. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Is there a question for Claire?
We have, as part of the reading work, we have started to look at whether coloured overlays have an impact on performance. We haven't looked closely at the data yet, but certainly our patients, what seems to be happening is that our patients report that actually it does make reading easier. It's not clear using the task that we've been using whether that translates into an improvement in reading performance, but I think we need to look at it more carefully, and I think what we need to do next, if there isn't anything, the tasks are very short, so what we probably need to do is to make the reading tasks a lot longer so that we actually would be more likely to see these effects. But certainly perceptually, patients do report that it makes things easier for them.